Words of your mysteries. Lord, inspire them to seek your best for our nation, repeatedly requesting your guidance and following your leading. May they help people maximize possibilities for your glory. We pray in your sacred name. Amen.
Will you please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Madam President,
Senator from Iowa.
I ask for 1 minute in morning business.
Without objection.
We're getting perhaps close to a new presidency, and so there's a lot of talk about how the Senate might handle new cabinet people. Democrats are always lecturing Republican senators about approving future Biden cabinet nominees, even if we don't agree with them. Now that's pretty darn rich. In other words, they're saying something like this: don't follow our example from the past 4 years. Or another way to put that is, don't treat Biden nominees to the cabinet like we treated Trump nominees to the cabinet. So they seem to want two sets of rules for Republican and Democrat cabinet nominees, just like they want with judicial nominees. President Obama had 6 cabinet secretaries approved by the Senate on his inauguration day without even needing a roll call vote, so that President Obama could hit the ground running. President Trump had none by voice vote, and only 2 were approved by roll call votes before the nominee was, or before the president took over. Trump cabinet and sub-cabinet nominees, even ones that have been easily confirmed in previous Republican administrations, faced obstruction and partisan nay votes. Many Democrat senators who aspired to be president voted against virtually every single Trump nominee, no matter how well qualified. Now, my position has always been that a president should have the ability to choose his own cabinet people that he gets along with and who agree with him on policy, provided, of course, that they're qualified and will follow the law. And that's the way it should be. It is how I have approached nominees to date. But can Senate Republicans be sure that if we employ that standard, Democrats will play fair with the next Republican president? I don't want retaliation for its own sake, but the threat of holding Democrat senators to their own standards has been our only means of deterrence of obstruction. I want to hear from Democrats why we should not now adopt their standards and vote down nominees based on politics. I yield the floor. I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Madam President,
Assistant Democratic Leader,
ask consent the quorum call be dispensed with.
without objection. The leadership time is reserved. Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to resume consideration of the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nomination, the Judiciary, Charles Edward Ashley, Jr. of Tennessee, to be United States District Judge for the Eastern District of Tennessee.
Madam President,
Assistant Democratic Leader,
Madam President, I'm sorry that the senator from Iowa who spoke before me left the floor before I could get his attention. Senator Grassley is my friend. We've served together for many years. We've worked on a lot of things together, and I'll bet we will in the future. I like working with him. He shoots from the hip, tells you exactly what he thinks. He's got, I know this sounds a little vain, but a little Midwestern approach to him that I like a lot. And he just gave us a little reminder here about the difficulties that faced some of the Trump nominees on the floor of the United States Senate. I remember that. There were some that were delayed because of very basic things. They had not filed their financial disclosure forms and the ethics reports, which were expected of all cabinet nominees. I don't expect President-elect Biden to cut any corners. I expect his nominees to follow the rules and the law, and I'm hoping that they will have bipartisan support when they come to the Senate. I want to give this president a chance to get off to a good, solid start, and he's going to need it. We are in the midst of this pandemic. The numbers that roll in every single day are frightening. Even in my home state of Illinois, where Governor Pritzker and Mayor Lightfoot and so many others have worked hard to establish standards of conduct which will keep people safe, we know that the numbers are just unacceptable in terms of infections and hospitalizations and sadly deaths as well. Over 300,000 Americans have died. We want to make sure that President Biden, Vice President Harris have the team and the wherewithal, the resources to respond quickly when they take office on January 20th. I hope my Republican friends will join me in that effort. They have every right to expect these nominees to answer the very basic questions that are required, but I hope that they'll also do their best to expedite that process so that those going into critical positions to keep our country safe from this pandemic are in place, as well as those who are going to serve our nation in critical capacities, whether it's Secretary of State or Attorney General or Department of Homeland Security. But I look forward to working with my friend from Iowa, and I take heed of his warning that we will hold these nominees to the same standards as we held President Trump's nominees. Madam President, we are at the 11th hour before a funding deadline where the budget of the United States is at stake. Tomorrow, the continuing resolution expires, and we are facing the prospect of another continuing resolution. I pray that we don't do that. This has been a very disappointing year for the appropriations process. Historically, the process begins with the president's budget, and then comes a budget resolution passed by the House and the Senate for the spending priorities in the next fiscal year. We didn't do that. Then there's an allocation, usually, after the passage of a budget resolution, of how much each subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee can work with, total amounts of dollars. We didn't do that. Then the subcommittees have hearings, and some of these subcommittees of appropriations, many hearings, to explore whether the dollar amounts that are allocated for a certain purpose really are well spent and serve their purpose. We didn't do that. Then the subcommittee is supposed to meet and vote out an appropriations bill at the end of that process, reporting it to the full committee, and we didn't do that. And then the Appropriations Committee is supposed to take up the subcommittee's product, debate it, subject to amendment, and pass it out for consideration by the full body. We never did that as well. The matter is supposed to come to the floor of the Senate be debated as well, perhaps amended, pass the Senate if it has the right necessary vote. We didn't do that. And then it's supposed to go to the House of Representatives and to see how it matches up with their similar work product. We didn't do that either. Ultimately, it may result in a conference report, according to the rules, between the House and the Senate, and that never happened. So the entire budget and appropriations process was completely avoided. And we find ourselves extending a continuing resolution for the spending of the United States government for weeks at a time until after the election. So now we face the prospect of the 11th hour, a decision to finish the work we were elected to do or to simply delay this situation again. Well, we need to do our job, and we need to do it now. We need to pass our annual appropriations bills and to keep the government running. I cannot imagine the unforgivable and embarrassing tragedy it would be if the government is shut down for our failure to reach a decision. We need to pass a COVID relief bill. I was happy to join a group of 10 senators, 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans. 3 weeks ago, we met for dinner one night, safe social distancing in one of the members' houses, and spent several hours talking about our frustration that we hadn't passed a COVID relief bill since March when we passed the CARES Act. And we know that things have gotten worse in this country, not only in the pandemic, but also in the state of the economy. For some reason, we just couldn't reach an agreement, the two parties. Well, this mixed group of senators, both political parties, had a bold idea: let's try to do it ourselves. So we sat down, and in the course of 3 weeks, I cannot tell you how many hours we spent on the phone, Zoom calls, other conference calls. Calls were even taking place on Thanksgiving Day, talking about what a COVID relief bill might look like. And some of the items we debated long and hard, most of them we agreed on. This last Tuesday, this week, we reported our bill to the United States Senate, to the floor of the Senate, and to the leaders. And we didn't just give them a memo with concepts, we gave them an actual bill that could be introduced today. The bill itself is significant in that it has $748 billion in spending. The areas of spending are fairly predictable. Extending unemployment insurance benefits with $300 a week federal supplement. $300 billion for business loans for those that are struggling to survive. An additional $13 billion for the food stamp program, now known as SNAP, so that people who are relying on that, perhaps in the midst of unemployment, will have enough to eat. $13 billion for our farmers, $25 billion for emergency rental assistance to avoid evictions, $34 billion to hospitals, clinics for help as well. A portion of that set aside for rural hospitals, $16 billion for testing and tracing and the logistics of delivering the vaccine across America, $12 billion for a CD5 project for minority businesses, $5 billion for additional help with mental health counseling. And we know that this pandemic and the economy have taken their toll on the mental health of America. $82 billion for education, $20 billion of that for higher education. School districts and schools, universities too, have spent a lot of money because of COVID-19, and we want to help them get back on their feet. $10 billion for child care, a critical element for many families. If they can't find child care, many people can't go back to work. We want to give them help. $10 billion for broadband. Expanding broadband became critically important when kids relied on it to continue their education and remote learning. $45 billion for transportation, everything from the airline industry to Amtrak to transit to buses. They've all been hit hard, and we need them to come back with our economy. $10 billion for our postal service, and boy, have they worked hard during this pandemic to keep up with the demands. and extensions of opportunities to use CARES money into the next fiscal year, next calendar year, I should say. And there were more. We reached agreement on all of these and came up with a bill that we presented to the leadership on both the House and the Senate, both parties. The good news is they didn't ignore it. They embraced it and started their own negotiations at the very highest levels of leadership in the Congress. Fingers crossed, we may come up with a bill today, COVID relief bill. So from the time of our press conference on Tuesday to the delivery of a product as soon as today is an amazing accomplishment when you consider all the time that we've spent waiting in hopes that we could find that solution. We have made significant progress. Funding the government is basic to our work in Congress, and this COVID relief bill is essential as well. Now, I'm disappointed in our work product as pride and disappointment. The disappointment is the fact that we didn't reach an agreement on state and local government assistance. I favor that strongly, and I hope we turn to that issue as soon as we return in January. Also, there was a question of liability in lawsuits during the time of COVID-19. We offered several alternatives. The Republicans countered with theirs. We never had a meeting of the mind on that issue. I hope that we do return to it at some point, soon. We need to put government spending on a course that makes sense for the next year that we're going to be tackling as soon as January. For the military and the FBI, public housing and transportation, medical research, cybersecurity, governing is the worst in any way that we approach it. Governing by CR is the worst possible way to do business. Continuing resolutions impede our government's ability to operate efficiently and frankly waste money. Taxpayers deserve better. A continuing resolution would leave us operating under funding levels which, before we face this national emergency, which is in every part of America today, it would restrict agencies from shifting dollars around to meet the challenges, and it would hurt their ability to plan ahead, hire and train new employees, start new projects. Continuing resolutions cause delays in contracts and grants when we need them the most. There are many examples of these. Funding for medical research. I don't think there's an American alive today who doesn't value medical research more today than they did a year ago. The Warp Speed project appears to be a dramatic success, and I pray that it will be. Although I've been a frequent critic of this administration, I want to give them credit for organizing this effectively and delivering a vaccine in a timely way, almost amazing timely way, in this pandemic that we face. I thank all who were involved in it, especially the scientists and researchers who didn't give up until they found these vaccines. We know that FEMA has been would be prohibited from awarding Homeland Security grants to state and local governments unless we do our business of passing a budget. Safety and efficiency improvements in our transportation programs, such as bridge repairs, need to be timely and implemented. States and cities would not receive their community development block grants, which they desperately need. The list goes on and on. Our constituents elected us to do a job, and part of that job is to create a budget for this government. Months of bipartisan committee work and weeks of bipartisan negotiations should not be cast aside. I'm hopeful that we finalize a deal today and vote on it as early as today or tomorrow at the latest. We can't expect people to wait with any patience. We've waited too long ourselves. Let me close on a topic that is related to this, Madam President. The press reports of Russian hacking into the security systems of the United States are as troubling as can be. This is nothing short of a virtual invasion by the Russians into critical accounts of our federal government. It is possible that they have compromised some of the most important and sensitive information that this government owns, information that we rely on to keep America safe. Of course, Vladimir Putin denies it, but we know better. It's not the first time. but I hope it's one of the last times. We need to make it clear to Mr. Putin, to China, to Iran, to North Korea, and to any nation that would compromise and breach our security that there is a price to pay. No, I'm not calling for an invasion myself or all-out war. I don't want to see that happen. But it's no longer a buddy-buddy arrangement between the United States and Vladimir Putin. We have to take this man very seriously because he is a serious threat to the United States when he captures this kind of information which we use so that our troops are safe in the field, that we're safe in our homes. We thought we had a defense mechanism established. It turns out that it failed and compromised the integrity of our security in the cyber world. We need to do better. Through the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Defense, dedicate the resources and say to Mr. Putin and others like him around the world, we're not going to stand by and let you take advantage of us. There will be a price to pay for this. And frankly, if we do anything less than that, it is hard to imagine we're doing our best to protect this great nation. There'll be more. I'm sure there'll be secure briefings for members of Congress going into detail here. But the news that's coming out in the media is very troubling. We need to do all that we can to keep America safe. And when adversaries such as Russia torment us, tempt us, breach the security of our nation, we need to respond in kind. Madam President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Madam President.
Majority Whip?
Madam President, is the Senate in quorum call?
It is.
I would ask unanimous consent that quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Madam President, I am encouraged that we are making progress on coronavirus relief legislation, but we need to finish up and get this bill out the door. The virus is surging around the country, and we need to get help to struggling Americans as soon as possible. The time for debate is over. Let's get this done. Madam President, we started this week out with a tremendously hopeful moment in our COVID fight, the first vaccinations against this virus. It's incredible that barely a year since we first learned about the virus, we have a vaccine, with more vaccines likely on the way. And I've been thinking a lot this week about the people who volunteered for vaccine trials. We've gained a new appreciation this year for a lot of people whose work we might have taken for granted in the past. The farmers and grocery store workers and truck drivers who've kept food on our grocery store shelves. The delivery drivers whom we have relied on so heavily this year, who have brought our packages to us so that we can minimize our time at the store. All the workers whose jobs can't be done from home, from electrical workers to trashmen to pharmacists who get up every day and put on their masks and go out and keep our country running. And of course, our nation's medical professionals who have faced down this virus with courage and determination and with great compassion. There have been a lot of quiet heroes this year, Madam President, and the people who volunteered for vaccine trials should be high on that list. A lot of courageous people stepped forward when we needed them. And we would not have a COVID vaccine today without their willingness to help. Madam President, Monday was the beginning of what will hopefully be a decisive victory in our COVID battle. And we owe that to the hard work and persistence of medical researchers. But we owe it also to the vaccine trial volunteers who enabled researchers to complete the process of developing a safe and effective vaccine. It's no exaggeration to say that the bravery of vaccine volunteers could end up saving hundreds of thousands or even millions of lives. I doubt we'll ever know most of the volunteers' names, but they are heroes of this battle just the same. And I am very grateful for the opportunity that they've given us to defeat this virus. Madam President, before I close, I'd like to take a moment to pay tribute to one of my staffers, Johanna Jablonski. Johanna's originally from the small town of Ethan, South Dakota, is a graduate of and former basketball star at Mount Marty College. She first joined our team as a summer intern working in Sioux Falls. And a little over 6 years ago, she moved to Washington, D.C. and became a permanent member of the office. She started out as a staff assistant and eventually worked her way up to become my scheduler and our starting softball pitcher, I might add, here in D.C. Madam President, when Johanna first came to my office, she intended to move back home after a year or two. But God had plans for her here in D.C. About 3 years ago, she met her husband, Anthony, at a Boy Scout fish fry at St. Peter's Church right here on Capitol Hill. I know Johanna regards that as a blessing for her, but it was a blessing for our office too, because we got to keep her around a little longer than she had originally anticipated. But now, in a couple of weeks, Johanna will move back to South Dakota. And we are all very excited for her. But she will be sorely missed. Madam President, I know I don't have to tell you or any other senator here just how important the role of a scheduler is in any office. The days here on Capitol Hill are busy. Our schedulers are the ones who bring some semblance of organization to an otherwise chaotic day, making sure that we get to connect with our constituents in town, to make it to committee hearings and votes on time, get the briefings we need on legislation, and much more. Johanna's not only a good scheduler, she is a great one. I will miss her patience, her professionalism, and her unparalleled ability to keep the trains running on time. But what I and I think the rest of my staff will miss the most about Johanna is her kindness. Johanna has had a positive impact on pretty much every staffer who's worked for me during her time here, taking the time to get to know each of them on a personal level. Whether she's interacting with an agency head, a constituent, or a fellow staffer, she is always the same: unfailingly gracious, patient, and kind. No matter how busy or chaotic the day, Johanna can be counted on to bring a steady hand and a positive attitude. She is a woman of deep faith, and it shows. And I am sad to see her go. But I want to wish her the very best of everything as she embarks on this new chapter in life. Johanna, thank you for all your hard work on behalf of South Dakota. You will be missed. Madam President, I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
I ask consent that further proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Well, we in Congress are no strangers to December funding deadlines or the occasional pre-Christmas cliffhanger. In that respect, the situation we face now is familiar. Funding for the federal government is hanging in the balance. In the next few days, Congress will either succeed or fail at providing secure and stable funding for our military commanders, our federal departments, and key investments for our future. Fortunately, our colleagues on the Appropriations Committee and their House counterparts have been on the case. Bipartisan, bicameral committee work has full-year government funding legislation on the 1-yard line. I'm optimistic that if we can close out our other parallel business, we should be able to fund the government and move forward together. But that brings me to the way in which this year is unlike anything we've seen before. It's been more than 9 months since our nation began to feel the full force of the COVID-19 pandemic. The American people have done what Americans do when crises come knocking. Essential workers have kept our nation running. Healthcare professionals have worked day and night to care for strangers. Heroic American businesses have adapted, reinvented, and obeyed the advice of medical experts. Now we can see the light at the end of the tunnel, Mr. President. Operation Warp Speed has given us safe and effective vaccines in record time, but the American people need another bridge to those better days that are not so far off. The country needs Congress to come through with another targeted rescue package. They've waited months. They've waited and suffered, and some have died while needless political games have played out. The American people wait for more emergency assistance ought to be over. For months, I've called for a targeted bipartisan package that would put hundreds of billions of dollars into payroll support, testing, vaccine distribution, extended unemployment aid, safe schools, and other essential priorities. So I'm encouraged that our Democratic colleagues have now embraced this framework that's been the right solution for our country all this time, and a bipartisan, bicameral agreement appears to be close at hand. The outline that I've been discussing with Democratic leader Speaker Pelosi and Leader McCarthy would get another huge dose of bipartisan support out the door as fast as possible. We've yet to nail down every detail, but in broad strokes, we've been discussing the targeted second round of job-saving Paycheck Protection Program that Republicans have sought since last summer. We're discussing many tens of billions of dollars for distributing vaccines, COVID testing, and equipping safe schools to get our kids' educations back on track. We're discussing extended important unemployment programs. At the particular urging of President Trump and Secretary Mnuchin, who have continued to be the champions of cash relief for American families, we're discussing more direct impact payments for individuals, plus the bonus for families with children. These are just some of the major pillars, and equally important, Mr. President, we're agreeing to be smart about financing these extraordinary policies. Now listen to this. We intend to repurpose more than $400 billion in unspent funds, which we already allocated in the CARES Act. It turned out these funds did not need to be tapped to restore basic stability to our economy. It's time we put that money to urgent use. Like I said at the time yesterday, I'm heartened by our discussions and our progress. I believe all sides are working in good faith toward a shared goal of getting an outcome. But I will say this, Mr. President, in my judgment, we're very close to a point that arises in every major negotiation. It's the point where each side faces a fork in the road. Do we want to lapse into politics as usual and let negotiations lose steam? Do we want to haggle and spar like this was an ordinary political exercise, get wrapped around the axle of language or policy riders that we know are controversial? Or, on the other hand, after months of inaction, do we want to move swiftly and with unusual bipartisanship to close out our issues, seal the deal, and write text that can quickly pass into law? In short, we're near the point in this process where we decide if we're going to stay on the fast track or drift back toward business as usual. I say the answer should be obvious. After all these months, Struggling Americans don't just need action. They need action fast, fast. So I continue to appreciate our productive discussions, but I hope we also remember just how urgent the situation is for millions and millions of our fellow citizens. So for the information of all senators, we're going to stay right here, until we're finished, even if that means working through the weekend, which is highly likely. And if we need to further extend the Friday funding deadline before final legislation can pass in both chambers, I hope we'll extend it for a very, very short window of time. Our citizens can't afford for us to get bogged down in the back and forth. Let's finish up our bipartisan framework. Let's make law as soon as possible. That's what our people deserve. I suggest that.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President,
The Democratic leader?
are we in quorum?
Yes.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Now, Mr. President, we continue to move closer to a final agreement on an omnibus appropriations bill and a package of emergency federal aid to provide the country relief from the continued impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Yesterday, House and Senate leadership worked well into the night. We resumed first thing this morning. While many, if not all, of the difficult topics are behind us, a few final issues must be hammered out. We're very close to an agreement, but the details really matter. When it comes to unemployment benefits, stimulus checks, aid to small businesses, and so much else, we have a responsibility to get this right. People's lives depend upon it. I will note that had the Republican majority joined in negotiations any time in the last 6 months as we had requested, we would not be in the unfortunate position of negotiating against the government funding deadline. Leader McConnell kept calling for a pause, and here we are. And I also note that we would have a much larger bill that met crucial needs of so many Americans if Republicans had not been so intransigent. But we're all eager to conclude our work and deliver the relief that the American people have been waiting for. Everyone wants to see this get done, and soon. It's not an easy feat or process. We're talking about providing relief to a country hurting from coast to coast, a country with tens of millions of unemployed workers and more slipping into poverty every day, a country with businesses of all sizes and varieties struggling in different ways and more in danger of closing for good every week, a country that just yesterday suffered the worst day of the entire pandemic, the most cases, the most hospitalizations, the most deaths, more than 3,600 American lives. Already, we know that the size of this emergency relief bill would be the largest stimulus in the history of our country, if not for the other COVID relief bill, the CARES bill, which I negotiated with Secretary Mnuchin and we passed earlier this year. Let me say again, we are putting the final touches on what would be the largest stimulus in the history of the country, with the exception of the CARES Act, larger even than ARA, the stimulus bill Congress passed in the wake of the financial crisis in 2009. None of the remaining hurdles cannot be overcome. Everyone is committed to achieving a result, and we will not leave until we get the job done. I yield the floor.
Are you ready? Okay. All post-cloture time has expired. The question occurs on the Ashley nomination. Is there a sufficient second? Appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carver. Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mrs. Loeffler, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney,
Hey, Megan, do you have a script for the mayor?
Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Cornyn, Hyde-Smith, Manchin, Scott of Florida, Thune. Senators voting in the negative: Cantwell, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Feinstein, Schumer, Smith, Udall, Warren. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Leahy, no. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Tester, aye.